June Carter woke up at 3 in the morning with a melody she'd never heard before running through her mind like water finding its path downhill. She didn't move at first, just lay there in the dark of her Nashville bedroom, listening to something that felt like it had been delivered rather than created. The melody was insistent, circular. It kept returning to itself like a question that wouldn't let her sleep until she found the answer. She knew what the answer was. She'd been avoiding it for months. This was 1962. June was married to someone else. Johnny Cash was married to someone else. And the thing growing between them was exactly the kind of complication that destroyed careers, families, and reputations in Nashville. But the melody didn't care about any of that. If you've ever felt something you knew you shouldn't feel, something that arrived uninvited and refused to leave, consider subscribing. Some stories are about the music. This one's about what happens before the music can exist. June Carter came from country music royalty, the Carter family, voices that had defined the genre before most people knew there was a genre to define. She'd been performing since childhood, knew every stage, every crowd, every unspoken rule about how to navigate an industry that smiled at you in public and made decisions about your future in rooms you'd never be invited into. By 1962, she was established, respected, part of Johnny Cash's touring show, which meant long bus rides, late nights, and the kind of proximity that makes feelings grow whether you want them to or not. Johnny was struggling. Everyone around him could see it. The pills, the mood swings, the performances where brilliance and chaos competed for control. His marriage was failing in that slow, painful way where both people know it's over, but nobody knows how to stop the momentum of lives built around expectations. June saw all of it, and somewhere in those bus rides and backstage moments, somewhere between watching him be extraordinary and watching him barely hold himself together, she'd fallen in love with him. She'd fought it, pushed back against it with every piece of practical wisdom she'd accumulated over 33 years of living. This wasn't some teenage infatuation. This was dangerous, messy, the kind of thing that would hurt people she cared about. But love doesn't ask permission. It doesn't check whether the timing is convenient or whether the circumstances are appropriate. It just arrives. And that night in 1962, it arrived as a melody June had never heard before, carrying words she hadn't written yet but somehow already knew. June got out of bed, walked to the small writing desk in the corner of her bedroom where she kept paper and pencils for moments when ideas struck. She hummed the melody quietly, trying to pin it down before it evaporated the way dreams do in the cold light of consciousness. The melody had a structure, verses and a chorus that circled back on itself. But something was missing. There was space in it, room for something else. Horns, she thought. Mexican-style horns, mariachi trumpets that would give it color and urgency and danger. The image that came with the melody was fire. Not destructive fire, the kind of fire you walk toward knowing it'll burn you, knowing you can't help yourself. She started writing. The first line came fully formed. Love is a burning thing. Not can be, not might be, is, definitive, undeniable. And it makes a fiery ring. The ring wasn't marriage, it was enclosure, entrapment. The way love surrounds you until there's no direction that doesn't lead back to itself. June kept writing, the words arriving with an ease that felt almost like dictation, like she was discovering something that already existed rather than creating something new. Bound by wild desire, I fell into a ring of fire. There it was, the admission she'd been avoiding, the acknowledgment that this thing with Johnny wasn't a choice she was making. It was something that had already happened, something she'd already fallen into. She wrote the whole song in less than an hour, lyrics and melody structure, the arrangement ideas, all of it. Then she sat there looking at what she'd written, knowing exactly what it meant and exactly why she couldn't give it to Johnny. If you've ever created something that revealed more than you wanted to reveal, leave a comment. I'd like to know what you did with it. June Carter kept Ring of Fire in her desk drawer for months. She'd take it out sometimes, play through it quietly when she was alone, make small adjustments to lyrics or melody, but she never showed it to anyone, because showing it to Johnny would be an admission, a confession. It would take something that existed in the space between them, something they could both pretend wasn't there, and make it undeniable. And June understood Nashville. She understood how quickly respect could turn to judgment when a woman stepped outside the lines of acceptable behavior. A man could be complicated, troubled, fighting demons, and people would make space for that. Talk about genius that came with a cost. But a woman in love with a married man? That was simpler. That was just scandal. June's sister Anita noticed the song first, saw it on June's desk one afternoon and asked about it. June deflected, said it was just something she'd been working on, nothing serious, maybe for another artist someday. But Anita knew her sister's voice when she heard it, knew what it sounded like when June was holding something back. "This is about him," Anita said. Not a question. June didn't answer. Did it need to? "June, this song, it's extraordinary. You can't just leave it in a drawer. I can't give it to him either." "Why not?" "Because once I do, there's no taking it back. Once he hears it, he'll know. Everyone who hears it will know." Anita looked at her sister for a long moment. "They already know, June. The only person pretending they don't is you." It took another 6 months before June finally played Ring of Fire for Johnny. Not in some dramatic moment, not as a confession or declaration, just a quiet afternoon in 1963 when they had time between shows, and she pulled out the song like it was something casual she'd been meaning to share. Johnny listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "That's about us," he said finally. June didn't deny it, didn't confirm it either, just met his eyes and said, "It's a good song. It's more than good. I wrote it for you, if you want it." Johnny wanted it immediately, wanted to record it, arrange it, release it as a single. June helped with the arrangement, brought in the mariachi-style horns she'd heard in that pre-dawn melody, built it into something that sounded like love and danger and inevitability all wrapped together. The session players thought it was bold, unconventional. Country music didn't usually sound like this, didn't borrow from mariachi tradition, didn't build arrangements around circular horn lines that created tension rather than resolution. But that was the point. Ring of Fire wasn't supposed to sound safe. It was supposed to sound like what it felt like, standing in the middle of something you couldn't control, knowing it would hurt you, unable to walk away. Johnny recorded it in March 1963. His voice carried every ounce of recognition that June had poured into the writing. He sang it like a man who understood exactly what fire she was talking about. And when June heard the final recording, heard her melody and her words and her confession turned into something undeniable, she knew there was no going back. They'd made it real, made it public, made it permanent. If this moment resonates with you, if you understand what it means to take something private and make it permanent, hit that subscribe button. Not for me, for the moments when art becomes admission. Ring of Fire became Johnny Cash's biggest hit, #1 on country charts, crossed over to pop, became the song that defined him for millions of people who'd never heard Folsom Prison Blues or I Walked the Line. The public loved it, critics praised it, radio stations played it constantly, and nobody, at least nobody who said it out loud, acknowledged what the song actually was. A love letter from a woman to a married man, written with full knowledge of every complication that admission carried. June and Johnny didn't hide their relationship after that, didn't announce it either, just let it exist in the space between public performance and private reality that Nashville had always made room for as long as you didn't force people to acknowledge it directly. Johnny eventually divorced. June eventually divorced. They married each other in 1968, 5 years after Ring of Fire made them both famous for a feeling they'd been trying not to name. And through all of it, through the tabloid speculation, through the judgment from people who thought they understood, through the decades of marriage that followed, Ring of Fire remained, not just as a hit song, as evidence, proof that June had written the truth before the truth was acceptable, that she'd taken the risk of admission before she knew whether it would destroy her or define her. Ring of Fire became Johnny Cash's biggest hit, #1 on country charts, crossed over to pop, became the song that defined him for millions of people who'd never heard Folsom Prison Blues or I Walked the Line. The public loved it, critics praised it, radio stations played it constantly, and nobody, at least nobody who said it out loud, acknowledged what the song actually was: a love letter from a woman to a married man, written with full knowledge of every complication that admission carried. June and Johnny didn't hide their relationship after that, didn't announce it either, just let it exist in the space between public performance and private reality that Nashville had always made room for, as long as he didn't force people to acknowledge it directly. Johnny eventually divorced. June eventually divorced. They married each other in 1968, 5 years after Ring of Fire made them both famous for a feeling they'd been trying not to name. And through all of it, through the tabloid speculation, through the judgment from people who thought they understood, through the decades of marriage that followed, Ring of Fire remained, not just as a hit song, as evidence, proof that June had written the truth before the truth was acceptable, that she'd taken the risk of admission before she knew whether it would destroy her or define her. This wasn't just about a song. It was about the choice between silence and truth, between protecting yourself and revealing yourself, between keeping something private and making it permanent. June Carter woke up with a melody that demanded to exist. She wrote it down knowing exactly what it would cost, and she gave it to the world anyway, not because she knew it would become a classic, but because love, real, complicated, impossible love, deserves to be named, even when naming it burns everything down. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, subscribe. Share it with someone who understands what it means to write the truth before you're ready. And remember, the most honest art isn't always the safest art. Sometimes it's just a woman, a melody, and the decision to stop pretending.